Stop the Apartheid Lie, the orchestrated multi-armed campaign to accuse Israel of being an apartheid state. Good afternoon and thank you all for joining us today. I am Advocate Uri Morad and I'm the Director of JIJ's International Law and Public Diplomacy Department. Joining me for today's session is Mr. Matan Meron, JIJ's Special Liaison to the United Nations. Hi Matan.
Hi Uri, and thank you for having me here today. As you mentioned, I coordinate JIJ's efforts with the UN since JIJ received consultative status at the United Nations.
Thank you. Great having you with us today, Matan. So before we start today's session, I want to tell you shortly about the Jerusalem Institute of Justice, or JIJ as we call it. JIJ is a leading legal research institute that strives to uphold human rights in the Middle East and is committed to safeguarding the legitimate standing of the State of Israel among the nations. JIJ's International Law and Public Diplomacy Department operates both in the international legal arena as well as in the public diplomacy arena, as we see these two as complementary. In 2021, JIJ received the prestigious UN Special Consultative Status to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, also known as ECOSOC, granted to us by the United Nations for our contribution to the protection and promotion of human rights. It is JIJ's mission to fight the constant attempts to delegitimize, demonize, and attempts to isolate the nation of Israel. For those who are joining us today for the first time, I want to invite you all to watch our previous sessions, which are all available on JIJ's YouTube channel. Our session of the day is dedicated to a discussion regarding the globally orchestrated campaign to accuse Israel of being an apartheid state through international NGOs together with the United Nations. During this webinar today, we will discuss the intricate relationship Israel holds with the United Nations over the past 70 years, in order to put things in the right context. We will then proceed with a short discussion regarding the roots of the baseless claim that Israel is an apartheid regime and its developments, of course, in recent years. We will then dissect the arguments behind these accusations, as they are basically presented by different international organizations, and we will learn about the dangerous ramifications of this multi-armed campaign which holds the goal to slander Israel. In addition, we will deal with the UN's hostility towards Israel and the ways in which it also partakes in the campaign to accuse Israel of being an apartheid state.
And more specifically, our session today will focus on the following 4 points. First, we will discuss the history of the UN's hostility towards Israel. Afterwards, we will examine the most recent manifestation of UN hostility to Israel through the formation of a commission of inquiry following Operation Guardian of the Walls. And then we will discuss the slanderous Amnesty International report, which accused Israel of holding a system of apartheid. And lastly, we will speak about the ongoing implications of these dangerous developments and JIJ's efforts to combat them. Okay, so let's dive right in. The first topic we will discuss is the UN hostility towards Israel, which is a core element of the apartheid campaign. This topic was also the focus of a whole webinar of JIJ titled The UN's 70-Year Relationship with Israel. The UN's approach to Israel is characterized by hypocrisy, bias, and double standards.
Definitely, and the UN's overly unproportionate focus on Israel has actually brought up about dozens of condemnations over the years in the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, as well as in the General Assembly and all other UN bodies. For instance, in the Security Council itself, there have been up until today 225 resolutions concerning Israel. And just as a comparison, North Korea has been the focus of 27 resolutions, while 21 resolutions were adopted concerning Syria, and only 14 Security Council resolutions have focused on Iran. And maybe another way to look at the UN's one-sidedness when it comes to Israel is through the lens of the General Assembly. In the years 2020 to 2021, the General Assembly adopted 17 resolutions against Israel, compared with just 6 resolutions for the rest of the world combined.
So, tell me, Uri, why is the United Nations as a whole, and the General Assembly in particular, so prejudiced against Israel?
Well, Matan, this is due to the automatic majority against Israel in the United Nations. You see, there are 193 UN member states which are divided into formal regional groups. With that being said, the UN member states are also grouped together based on mutual interests. The 22 Arab states who are brought together through the Arab League are in the core of this automatic majority, and these 22 Arab states are also members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which consists of 56 member states altogether. And these 56 states are also part of the Group of 77, which is actually a coalition of 134 developing countries. So, whenever an anti-Israeli resolution is brought up in the General Assembly, this same coalition of, as we said, 134 member states vote as one, and together they create this automatic majority against Israel.
Yes, that is very true. And I'd like to give as an example an outcome of this certain majority against Israel, and also a vivid manifestation of the UN's unreasonable treatment of Israel, the adoption of Resolution 3379 by the General Assembly in 1975. And if I might add, on a personal note, this was probably one of the lowest points of the UN. The resolution, which uncoincidentally passed just a year after the Palestinian Liberation Organization received permanent observer status in the UN, determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Right after the adoption of the resolution, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Chaim Herzog, delivered a historic speech in which he denounced the resolution by tearing it to pieces on the UN stage. This delusional determination, referring to Zionism as a form of racism, was thankfully revoked in 1991.
Yes, and it's actually worth mentioning in this regard that this vote back in 1991, as you've mentioned, to some extent signified a slight change in the balance of power in the United Nations. Since the automatic majority against Israel was, to some extent again, slightly damaged by the fall of the Soviet Union, which caused the transition of many countries from the Soviet bloc to the Western bloc that is led by the United States, by Canada, the United Kingdom, as well as the European Union.
Very true. But this doesn't mean things improved for Israel since then. It's enough to look at what happened in 2001 when the UN convened in Durban, South Africa, to what was called the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. But in reality, this conference devolved into a vicious forum for Israel bashing and anti-Semitism. The situation in the UN is so absurd that even the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, admitted the UN's biasness towards Israel when, in response to an Israeli student that claimed Israelis feel their country is being discriminated against at the UN, said the following: "Unfortunately, because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel has been weighed down by criticism and suffered from bias, and sometimes even discrimination."
Yes, and in recent years, the UN has been persistent in targeting Israel in various forms, as we've mentioned before. Alongside the condemnations Israel receives in the General Assembly and through the Security Council, Israel is also targeted in the Human Rights Council. Since its establishment back in 2006, 32 investigative bodies have been formed. 9, nearly a third, focus exclusively on Israel. These include commissions of inquiries, fact-finding missions, and committees of independent experts. And another UN mechanism used to bash Israel is the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, which has an unchanged mandate fixed in 1993 to investigate only Israel's violations of the principle and basis of international law. The UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine since 2016 is actually Michael Link, who is a law professor from Canada. Link has promoted an overly anti-Israeli narrative as a special rapporteur. In February 2022, a radical pro-Palestinian Italian lawyer, this time named Francesca Albeniz, was appointed to replace Link.
Okay, so far we've talked about the history of the UN hostility towards Israel and the mechanisms that enable the UN's unproportionate focus on Israel. And now I would like to move on to the main subject of this webinar, the latest Commission of Inquiry on Israel. The Commission was initiated on the 27th of May 2021 following Operation Guardian of the Walls, which was the latest conflict between Israel and Hamas. This is an urgent subject since this commission is about to present its first report in the upcoming Human Rights Council session next month.
Yes, and this investigation is yet another expression of the UN's outrageous, unproportionate focus on Israel. In the following few minutes, let's elaborate, Matan, on the dangers behind the formation of this UN body.
And I'd like to start by telling an old Jewish saying which goes like this: Emor li mihem chavarecha ve'omar lecha mi ata. It was said first by Chazal, the Jewish sages, and it translates to, tell me who your friends are, and I will tell you who you are. And if we take a look at the countries that promoted and called to form this commission, through UNHRC Resolution S30/1, we can learn a lot about the Human Rights Council itself. Pakistan and the Palestinian Authority were the ones that proposed this commission, and some of the countries that backed the resolution were China, Russia, Cuba, Somalia, and Venezuela. No European democracies voted in favor of founding this Commission of Inquiry. This goes to show the Human Rights Council is basically a platform for murderous states to pass any resolution they want. If they would want to pass a resolution that the sun sets in the east, they would have a majority for that as well.
That is absolutely ridiculous, of course. And even though the same year of the conflict in Israel and Gaza, 2021, there were 3,884 dead in Syria and thousands upon thousands more killed in Yemen, the same Human Rights Council didn't think there was any need to launch a commission of inquiry to investigate these conflicts.
And this is absolutely absurd. And now focusing on the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry. Would you agree with me that the terminology of the text behind it is clearly biased?
Well, the resolution forming the commission clearly states it's investigating, and I quote, root causes of recurrent tensions, instability and protraction of conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. And if this commission was actually formed as a response to the conflict, again, 2021 conflict, why is it investigating the origin of the conflict? And why is it investigating systematic discrimination?
Exactly. This kind of terminology was obviously put forth to set the path for the Commission's predetermined conclusion that Israel is racially discriminating Palestinians and Israeli Arabs alike. And it shouldn't be a surprise for us when the Commission assigns zero responsibility to the continuation of the conflict on the terrorist organization Hamas.
Yes, but this isn't the only manifestation of this Commission's prejudice towards Israel. This Commission is of unprecedented measures, and it's really important to understand. This particular commission, it has an extremely large budget of $4 million and unusually large staff of 18 permanent workers, and it's also one of only 2 UN bodies ever created with an open-ended mandate. which means that its mandate continues indefinitely even after it presents its current report. No other commission in history has ever received a continuing mandate.
And I'd like to add that possibly the most baffling fact regarding the formation of this commission is that although the inquiry was formed as a response to the 2021 Gaza conflict, as you mentioned, the scope of the investigation, as designated by its mandate, permits it to focus on issues related to the conflict since 1948. Additionally, like any other quote-unquote objective UN inquiry on Israel, the choice of the inquisitors is intended to predetermine the answer, even though this is in clear violation of UN rules. The Code of Conduct for Special Procedures mandate holders states very clearly that members of inquiries are required to follow to a specific code of conduct. They are supposed to uphold the highest standards of impartiality. And I quote, "The work of the Council shall be guided by the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity." So, with that in mind, let's have a look at who was entrusted with running the show of this prejudiced anti-Israel commission and see if they uphold standards of impartiality as should be expected.
Yes, and let's start with maybe the head of the commission, Navi Pillai. Navi Pillai is a South African jurist who was a key leader of the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, as mentioned earlier. In addition, as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Pillai played a pivotal role in promoting the slanderous Goldstone Report, which was a UN fact-finding mission on the 2008-2009 Gaza war, which included the outrageous lie that Israel intentionally targeted and murdered children. Since leaving office, Pillai made it a habit actually of promoting BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, to accuse Israel of apartheid. How absurd is it that the individual chosen to lead this so-called impartial probe has already accused Israel numerous times of being an apartheid state?
Extremely absurd. But it's not only her. The two other members of the committee, Miron Kutari and Chris Sidoti, both hold anti-Israel extremism and Palestinian partisanship records. Kutari is an Indian architect who served from 2000 to 2008 as the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. In 2002, he issued a report claiming Israel was guilty of ethnic cleansing during the Second Intifada. In 2006, Kotari encouraged countries to discontinue military cooperation with Israel in a UN press release. He also claimed that the factors underlying the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians are the World Zionist Organization and Jewish National Fund's colonization activities in the Jordan Valley. I kid you not, this is what he said. Now moving on to Chris Sidoti, the third judge presiding over this commission. Well, Sidoti is an Australian human rights lawyer who provides strategic guidance and advice to the Australian Centre for International Justice, which works in partnership with the Palestinian Human Rights Organization Council. And the centre issued a report in 2021 that calls on the Australian government to endorse BDS and the criminal prosecution of Israelis.
Right, so maybe to conclude, none of the three members of this so-called independent inquiry meet the UN's own rules of independence, impartiality, and objectivity. Moreover, the mandate and the structure of this inquiry have been designed to rewrite history from 1948, to find Israel guilty of apartheid, and to declare the root causes of conflict to be Jewish infringement of Muslim rights. The Human Rights Council should revoke immediately the resolution forming this commission.
And you would expect the UN to at least care about the way the commission is portrayed and place impartial judges. Okay, so now that we've discussed the challenges Israel faces in the UN these days, let's move on to discuss how the apartheid campaign is promoted by different civil society organizations.
Yes, and one of the world's largest civil society organization, Amnesty International, just recently published a 280-page report attempting to prove the outrageous claim that Israel is an apartheid regime. Matan, what can you tell us about this organization, Amnesty International?
Amnesty International is considered the most renowned human rights organization in the world. It is also extremely biased against Israel. It has published 209 reports on Israel alone, even more than what it has published on Iran, who systematically violates human rights, as we all know. Amnesty International is divided into many branches in different parts of the world. Its UK branch, which is the one that published the report on Israel in February 2022, titled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity, has a particular anti-Israel obsession. Already around a decade ago, it was clear that something terribly wrong was happening to this once respected moral watchdog when it hosted extremely anti-Israel events such as complicity in oppressions, do the media aid Israel? In promoting the event, it is explained that, and I quote, realities do not deter Zionists and the well-oiled pro-Israel lobby from purveying distortions of the truth as facts in their hasbara. For those of you who don't know, hasbara is the Hebrew term for public diplomacy of Israel. This goes to show how much the UK branch of Amnesty has been influenced by different anti-Israel groups.
And the unique extremeness of the UK branch in particular was apparent also following the release of the apartheid report, when the head of the Israeli branch of Amnesty, Molly Melliker, referred to the report as a punch in the stomach to many activists fighting for the Palestinian rights. Furthermore, Melliker asserted that the fact that the report colors the whole of Israel in one light doesn't actually promote the Palestinian cause, but rather the contrary. Now, before we explore the many lies and misleading claims spread by Amnesty in their most recent report, I would like you to expand on how the apartheid accusation against Israel has actually developed through the years.
So the international community has separated the term apartheid from its original South African context through the recent years, and it recognized it as a crime against humanity with definitions provided in the 1973 Apartheid Convention and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Palestine has been recognized as a state party to both the Rome Statute and the Apartheid Convention, even though it doesn't meet the internationally accepted criteria of statehood, which consists of a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to conduct international relations. Then, in February 2021, the International Criminal Court ruled that it has jurisdiction over the entirety of the disputed territories and announced the opening of a formal investigation into the situation in Palestine.
So once the legal framework for the definition of apartheid was laid down, there were a few NGOs that took the opportunity to raise the outrageous claim that Israel is committing some form of an apartheid regime. So how is Amnesty's report different?
Well, the Israeli NGO Yesh Din made allegations in 2020 on Israeli apartheid in the West Bank solely, while the international NGO Human Rights Watch claimed in 2021 that Israel was enforcing a form of apartheid in all the disputed territories, including the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And the Israeli NGO B'Tselem found in 2021 that Israel is maintaining a system of apartheid over Palestinians in the disputed territories, as well as over Israeli Arabs. Now, Amnesty International's conclusion was different. It concluded that Israeli authorities are enforcing a system of apartheid not only against Israeli Arabs and Palestinians living in the West Bank, Gaza, or East Jerusalem, but also against Palestinian refugees living outside of Israel. This was a major milestone in the global campaign seeking to label Israel an apartheid state and thus target its legitimacy as a state.
And the reports attempt to allege that Israel has maintained a system of oppression and domination over the Palestinians is actually preposterous and baseless claim. First and foremost, because Israeli Arabs are an integral part of Israeli society. There are Israeli Arabs who are military and police commanders. There are Israeli Arabs who serve as doctors and nurses, lawyers and judges, and even diplomats who represent Israel overseas. The Israeli Minister of Regional Cooperation, Isawi Frej, is another Arab Muslim, and there is an Arab Christian Supreme Court judge named George Kara, and actually just recently, Israel appointed Khaled Kaboub to serve as the first Arab Muslim on the Supreme Court.
And let's also not forget that there is an Arab party in the current coalition. Not only that, in June 2021, Israeli Arab parliament members from the opposition held a conference in the parliament titled Between Occupation to Apartheid. It's absurd to call such an inclusive and heterogenic state an apartheid state.
And as mentioned earlier, the report goes as far as to claim that Israel's apartheid, quote unquote, extends over Palestinian refugees whose, and I quote, right of return to their homes remains controlled by Israel. To claim that Israel imposes a system of oppression and domination on the Palestinians that lived in Lebanon, Jordan, or maybe in the United States is actually beyond absurd.
And another preposterous claim made in this report is that racism is embedded in Israel's legal system. As it says in the report, Israeli law, policy, and practices, as exercised differently but consistently in all areas and in all situations under its control, privilege those identified as Jewish Israelis and discriminate against, exclude, and segregate Palestinians. The report is above all a blatant mean to delegitimize the State of Israel and criminalize Israeli laws and practices, which are designed to safeguard Jewish identity, such as the law of return. The report infers that this law is a form of oppression over Palestinians. And I'd like to quote, "This unequal and separate citizenship structure has resulted in stark discrimination against Palestinian citizens in several ways. To propose that the law constitutes a form of discrimination towards Palestinians is outrageous, since its sole purpose is to safeguard Israel's Jewish character. Furthermore, this law and others are enshrined under international law and parallel the practices of many nation states."
And I would like to add in this regard that this terminology used in this report is clearly influenced by a certain agenda and is actually placed as a tool used to whitewash Palestinian terror. So not only does Amnesty assign zero responsibility for the continuation of the conflict on Hamas, but it also refers to Hamas, a designated terror group, throughout the report as a Palestinian armed group.
And maybe one of the most dangerous and outrageous claims put forth by Amnesty International is that the system of apartheid originated with the creation of Israel in 1948 and has been built and maintained for decades. By claiming the so-called Israeli apartheid began already with the creation of Israel, Amnesty is trying to argue that Israel is inherently illegitimate as a state.
Yes, but maybe instead of listening to a couple of Israelis like us trying to fight the apartheid claim, let's listen to the words of someone who actually experienced apartheid, Mazua Lakota, the leader of South African political party, who said that he tried to find a comparison between how we lived under the apartheid regime and the situation in Israel, and he couldn't not find even one.
Very strong words. And now let's move on to discuss the dangerous ramifications of the apartheid campaign. I'd like to start with Amnesty's apartheid report. One of the greatest dangers behind this report is that it calls upon the UN Security Council to impose targeted sanctions such as travel bans, and asset freezes against Israeli officials that are most implicated in the so-called crime of apartheid. The report also calls to impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel. We are greatly worried about the repercussions of this report. They might lead Israel to be labeled as a state with evil demeanors and to its isolation in the international arena. But these aren't the only possible byproducts of the report.
Yes, and as mentioned earlier, actually, an investigation of what has been named the situation of Palestine was commenced by the former chief prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, back in March 2021. And JAJ in this regard has actually used the same door opened by the Palestinians in order to bring Israelis to the court, in order to bring the real perpetrators in our region, and these are the leaders of both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. This was done by JAJ through the submission of communications containing evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. The Amnesty report and the COI's expected announcement that Israel is an apartheid state will surely influence the ICC and will probably add another angle to its investigation. We unfortunately expect that this will lead the ICC to accuse Israel of being an apartheid state, as the crime of apartheid is actually enshrined in the ICC's Rome Statute.
And there is another occurrence that can be regarded as a byproduct of this report, and that is the recent appointment of an outspoken anti-Israel Italian lawyer, Francesca Albanese, as the UN's Special Rapporteur on Palestine. This role was previously occupied, as mentioned earlier in this webinar, by Michael Link, who also held an extremely anti-Israel agenda. During his tenure from 2016 to 2022, Link published 12 reports and 84 UN press releases regarding the Palestinian territories. These publications systematically ignored the horrendous human rights violations committed by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas against both Israelis and Palestinians.
And actually, Francesca Albanese isn't any better. She has repeatedly equated the Palestinian Nakba with the Nazi Holocaust. She accused Israel of apartheid, she accused Israel of committing genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes. Moreover, in her application to the role, Albanese was asked whether she holds any views that could be an obstacle for her to the manner in which she executes the mandate of the position, to which she answered no. Yet just a year ago, Albanese admitted the opposite, saying her personal views on the Palestinian issue might compromise her objectivity.
And I'd like to add just a few examples of her biasness. She has said Israel is keeping captive millions of civilians. She organized a panel on Israeli apartheid, and she has campaigned for an arms embargo against Israel.
So, before we conclude today's session, I want to do a short recap of what we learned about today during this webinar. And we first discussed the background of the UN's hostility towards Israel, from Resolution 3379, which equated Zionism with racism, through the 2001 Durban Conference, and up until the dangerous Commission of Inquiry on Israel and the appointment of another biased anti-Israeli special rapporteur.
We also touched upon the background of the apartheid accusation on Israel and its invented legal justification. We discussed the one-sided and biased Amnesty International report on Israel, which accused Israel of committing the crime of apartheid. And lastly, we spoke about the ongoing ramifications of this report and the other anti-Israel bodies seeking to label Israel as an apartheid state. This includes other Israeli and international NGOs, and potentially also the ICC and the Commission of Inquiry on Israel.
After examining the various worldwide efforts to accuse Israel of this crime against humanity, I think it's safe to say that there is an orchestrated campaign to label Israel as an apartheid state. The purpose of this campaign is to isolate Israel in the international arena and promote different anti-Israeli interests while seeking to delegitimize the state of Israel. We in JAJ will do everything in our power to combat this campaign. And one of the ways we are fighting these horrendous lies is through webinars like this one, which help spread our messages. But another way is through petitions. And we in JAJ have shared 2 petitions online, one against the COI and one against Amnesty's apartheid report. We have also sent a letter directly to Amnesty International to protest their report, and we've utilized the COI's call for submission to submit 5 reports conducted by JAJ in recent years, which shed light on human rights violations and war crimes committed by the Palestinian Authority and by Hamas. In addition, we published an op-ed condemning both the COI against Israel and Amnesty's report. But maybe most importantly, we are preparing to combat the COI on Israel by submitting written statements and delivering a powerful oral statements in the general debate on the June Human Rights Council session.
We invite you to join our efforts by signing the petitions we put up on our website and sharing them. We also ask each and every one of you to reach out to at least 5 people and tell them about these malicious efforts to label Israel an apartheid state so we can reach an even larger audience.
Please reach out to me or Matan if you have any further questions on the information in this webinar. We will also send an update with the COI's report main points through the newsletter once it, of course, will be released.
And we promise to continue combating these dangerous attempts to delegitimize the State of Israel. Thank you for participating in this webinar, and please keep in touch.